The official investigation lasted only about 3 months. In the spring of 1959, it was closed with a phrase that has haunted this case ever since: the hikers had died from a compelling natural force. No further explanation. No named cause. Just an admission that something powerful and unidentified had ended 9 lives, filed away with no further comment. The area around the pass was closed to hikers for years afterward, the files were sealed for decades, and the families were left with closed coffins and a sentence that explained nothing at all. That phrase is really where the mystery begins, because for the next 60 years, one theory after another tried to give that force a name, and each one eventually collided with some stubborn detail of the evidence and fell apart. Let's start with the most sober, most frequently proposed explanation: a straightforward avalanche. On paper it's tidy. A slab of snow breaks loose above the tent, the hikers panic, cut their way out, and flee downhill before a second slide catches them. It would explain the slashed tent wall. It would explain the barefoot dash into the cold. It could even explain the crushing chest and skull injuries, since the sheer weight of packed snow can break bone without leaving a mark on the skin, in the same way a car crash compresses a ribcage without necessarily cutting through it. For years this was treated as the most credible answer available. But the terrain kept refusing to cooperate with it. The slope where the tent stood was measured at only around 15 or 16 degrees, considerably shallower than what normally triggers a slab release. Search teams who reached the site weeks later found no debris field, no fracture line, no tumbled blocks of hardened snow, nothing you'd expect from a slide powerful enough to crush a skull. The tent itself, though partially collapsed, was still standing at the rear, hardly consistent with having been buried by a major avalanche. And there was the matter of behavior after the fact. If snow had genuinely buried the camp, why would experienced survivalists abandon their food, their stove, and their only shelter for miles, and simply keep walking calmly downhill rather than digging back in for supplies? Every time this theory got raised, that shallow slope and that half-standing tent would sink it again. So naturally, people reached for something more dramatic, and given the era, the obvious candidate was the Soviet military. This was the Cold War at its coldest, and the northern Urals were exactly the kind of remote region where weapons testing could plausibly have occurred without civilian knowledge. Maybe some kind of experimental device, a parachute-delivered explosive or a pressure wave weapon, detonated near the tent. That could explain internal injuries with no external wounds. It could explain a sudden, panicked flight. Some point to unverified, endlessly repeated reports from other hikers and a nearby weather station describing strange lights in the sky that same winter as circumstantial support. For a certain kind of investigator, this became the whole case. Lights in the sky, radiation on the fabric, a suspiciously vague official conclusion, a government with a well-documented history of concealing accidents. It's a theory with an undeniable internal logic. But it runs into a very basic physical problem. There was no crater, no scorch marks, no blast debris, no trees shattered by an explosion, none of the physical signatures any kind of ordnance leaves behind. The bodies showed no burns. And the pattern of injuries, some hikers essentially unmarked, others catastrophically hurt, doesn't match how a single explosive event distributes force. A blast wave doesn't selectively crush 2 chests and 1 skull while leaving 4 other people to die of exposure an hour later a few yards away. Then there are theories that don't require any physics at all. Early investigators looked hard at the indigenous Montsi people, whose traditional hunting grounds bordered the area, and the ominous translation of Dead Mountain only added to the suspicion. But this line of inquiry was dropped quickly, because the footprint evidence exonerated them almost immediately. There was no third set of tracks anywhere on that slope. Just the 9 sets belonging to the hikers themselves, made in socks and bare feet, with no sign of pursuit, no sign of struggle, no sign that another living person had been anywhere near that tent that night. Montsi hunters, for their part, regarded the mountain not as cursed but simply as barren and unproductive for hunting, which is exactly why the group had the slope entirely to themselves. Other theories turned inward, suggesting some argument or violent falling out within the group itself. But again, the footprints argue against it. 8 or 9 sets of tracks moving downhill together, at the same pace, in the same direction, with no scattering, no sign of a chase, no evidence of a struggle. That is not the pattern of a group turning on each other. It's the pattern of a group that saw or experienced the same thing at the same time and made the same instantaneous decision together. And that, more than the injuries, more than the radiation, more than the missing soft tissue, is the detail that has made this case impossible to close for 6 decades. Not that people died in the mountains. Tragically, that happens. It's that 9 trained, disciplined winter travelers who understood better than almost anyone what extreme cold does to an unprotected body chose to leave their only shelter without proper clothing anyway. They knew with total certainty what would happen. And they did it regardless, all of them, together. Whatever occurred in or near that tent was, in that instant, more frightening than a near-guaranteed death by freezing. That's the real unanswered question at the center of the Dyatlov Pass incident. What could possibly be worse than the cold to 9 people who understood the cold that well? Over the following decades, the number of proposed explanations kept growing until the case developed its own body of folklore. Infrasound theory suggested that wind moving across the mountain's dome in a particular pattern could generate low-frequency waves capable of inducing panic and disorientation in the human body. Katabatic wind theories proposed a sudden, violent downslope gale, cold enough and loud enough to feel apocalyptic to anyone caught in it. Beyond those, less scientifically grounded ideas about cryptids, escaped prisoners, or secret experiments circulated for years, each with dedicated followers convinced they'd found the real answer, and each eventually running into the same wall of physical evidence that had sunk every theory before it. The case sat, mostly dormant, occasionally reopened by Russian prosecutors who promised fresh answers and generally delivered only renewed uncertainty, until 2 scientists who study avalanches professionally decided to approach the file the way you'd approach a structural engineering failure, methodically, without needing a villain. Johann Gorm, who heads the Snow and Avalanche Simulation Laboratory at Switzerland's EPFL, and Alexander Puzrin, a professor of geotechnical engineering at ETH Zurich, were drawn into the case after a 2019 renewal of the Russian investigation brought international media attention back to it. Puzrin, who grew up in Russia, had long known the story as part of national folklore but had never studied it professionally until then. Together, the two combed through the newly accessible Soviet-era archive material, consulted with mountaineering and forensic experts, and built analytical and computational models specifically designed to simulate how a slab of snow behaves on a slope like the one at Kholat Cycle, applying research techniques originally developed to understand how earthquakes can trigger delayed avalanches, sometimes hours after the initial disturbance. What their modeling found was quietly remarkable. The slope wasn't actually too shallow to fail, it just required conditions no one had modeled before. By carving a flat shelf into the hillside to pitch their tent, the hikers had unintentionally cut away supporting snow beneath a slab of dense, wind-packed material sitting on a weaker layer above it. Through that afternoon and into the night, strong katabatic winds kept depositing additional snow on top of that slab, adding weight to a structure that had already been destabilized by the cut. Critically, their simulations showed that this kind of failure doesn't have to happen immediately. Depending on conditions, it can take anywhere from roughly 7.5 to 13.5 hours after the initial cut for the load to finally exceed what the weak layer beneath can support. That delay is exactly why the collapse would have come hours after the tent was pitched, well into the night, while the hikers were resting, and why no one heard or felt anything coming. This delayed release mechanism also explains something every earlier avalanche theory had failed to account for: the total absence of a large debris field. Gorm and Puzrin's model didn't describe a massive slide burying the camp. It described something much smaller and more localized, a compact slab a few meters across, releasing and traveling only a short distance before stopping. Not enough to bury an entire campsite in a way that would leave an obvious scar for searchers to find weeks later, but, according to biomechanical modeling the researchers ran using data from crash test research on how the human chest and skull respond to blunt distributed force, more than enough to produce exactly the injury pattern found in the bodies. A block of dense, hardened snow coming down on people lying on a rigid surface, their own skis and packed gear beneath them acting like an anvil, can crush ribs and fracture a skull without ever breaking the skin above it, in much the same way vehicle crash forces do. It wasn't a strike from outside. It was compression, from above and below at once. Suddenly a sequence that had never made physical sense before started to cohere. The slab releases in total darkness. Several of the hikers nearest the point of impact, likely Thibaut Brignol, Zolotaryov, and Dubinina, are badly injured almost instantly, crushed where they lay. The others, uninjured but terrified and convinced a larger slide might follow, do the only thing trained mountaineers would do when snow above them starts moving. They get out immediately and head downhill, away from the loaded slope, toward the tree line where the forest anchors the snowpack and further sliding becomes far less likely. They cut through the tent fabric because the entrance was blocked or buried and there was no time to dig it free. They carried or dragged their injured companions as far as they could. They left in socks and bare feet because, in that first surge of adrenaline and fear, getting away from the slope felt more urgent than getting properly dressed, and the cold, for those first crucial minutes, felt more survivable than staying put. They reached the tree line, built what fire they could manage, and then the second, slower killer, the one they understood better than anyone but couldn't outrun, caught up with them. Hypothermia took the group one by one as some of them tried, too late, to climb back toward the tent and the gear they'd abandoned. It's important to be precise about what this study actually claims, because the honest answer is more modest than solved. Gorm and Puzerin have been explicit, including in follow-up statements and expeditions conducted in the years after their original 2021 publication in the journal Communications Earth and Environment, that they don't believe the case can ever be fully and finally closed, because no one who could describe what actually happened that night survived to tell it. What their research demonstrates is that the avalanche hypothesis, long dismissed as physically impossible given the shallow slope and missing debris field, is in fact coherent once you account for the specific combination of the hiker's own tent platform cut, the local wind loading, and a delayed slab release mechanism that simply hadn't been modeled before. Subsequent expeditions to the site in 2021 and after, using footage and photographic evidence gathered on location, documented small slab avalanches occurring nearby under comparable conditions, lending further physical support to the idea that the terrain was genuinely avalanche-prone in a way earlier investigators had underestimated. As for the other lingering anomalies, the missing tongue and eye tissue are consistent with known decomposition patterns for a body recovered from running water after months of exposure, and the radiation traces have most plausibly been linked to camping equipment and to at least one hiker's documented prior work in a facility handling radioactive materials, a mundane, traceable explanation rather than evidence of anything exotic. Investigators for 60 years, and why it took specialized simulation work, developed for entirely different engineering purposes, to finally reconstruct it. Both sides, it's worth saying, are arguing in good faith over the same limited set of frozen facts, and both understand that absolute certainty left that mountain the same night the hikers did.